"Don't drink that, sir." The maid snatched the billionaire's glass, exposing his fiancée. Every second after this became more unbelievable. Nobody in that ballroom expected the maid to be the one who saved his life. Not the guests. Not the groom. Not even the woman standing beside him in white. But when Maria reached out and knocked that glass from his hand, she wasn't just stopping a toast, she was stopping a murder. And what she exposed next would tear apart everything this family thought they knew. Hey, before we dive into today's story, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments. I read every single one. Today's story is about loyalty, betrayal, and a secret hidden in plain sight for years. Stay with me till the end, because the truth doesn't come out the way you think it does. The chandeliers hadn't even been lit yet, and already the ballroom felt like it was holding its breath. Maria Alvarez had polished that same brass railing on the east staircase of the Cole estate every single morning for 9 years. She knew the creak of the third step. She knew which window let in too much afternoon sun and warped the hallway portraits if the curtains weren't drawn by 2 o'clock. She knew this house better than she knew her own small apartment across town, because this house was where she'd spent nearly a decade of her life, first as a young woman fresh off the bus from Ohio with nothing but a suitcase and a letter of recommendation, and now, at 32, as the quiet, steady heartbeat of the Cole household. She also knew Ethan Cole better than almost anyone alive. Not the version of him the business magazines wrote about, the 34-year-old tech founder who'd built a logistics empire from a garage in Austin and turned it into a company worth more than some small countries. Not the version who shook hands with senators and had his photo taken beside private jets. Maria knew the real Ethan. The one who still took his coffee black with 1 sugar cube dropped in slow, the way his mother used to make it. The one who forgot to eat when he was stressed. The one who, 3 years ago, sat on the back porch steps at midnight after his mother's funeral and cried like a little boy while Maria quietly set a blanket over his shoulders and said nothing at all, because sometimes silence is the kindest thing you can offer someone. Ethan's mother, Eleanor Cole, had hired Maria all those years ago. "You have good eyes," Eleanor had told her during that first interview, in that clipped, warm way she had of complimenting people. "You see things other people miss." Maria hadn't understood what she meant then. She understood it now more than ever. Because for the last 8 months, ever since Ethan had gotten engaged to Victoria Hartwell, Maria had been seeing things. Small things. Things that didn't add up. Things she couldn't quite explain even to herself, let alone to Ethan, who lit up like a boy on Christmas morning every time Victoria walked into a room. Victoria was 33, effortlessly elegant, the kind of woman who made entire rooms rearrange themselves around her without seeming to try. She came from old money, or at least that's what she said, though Maria had never once seen a single relative of Victoria's set foot in this house. Not at Thanksgiving. Not at Ethan's birthday. Not even during the engagement party, where Victoria had smiled through champagne toasts and told a room full of Ethan's closest friends that her parents traveled too much to make it. Maria had learned, over the years, that the people who truly loved this family showed up. Victoria never did. There were other things too. The way Victoria's phone was always face down on the table, always. The way she'd usher Ethan out of rooms when certain calls came in. The way, just 2 weeks ago, Maria had walked into the study to dust the bookshelves and found Victoria standing over Ethan's desk, sliding a folder of papers back into a drawer just a half-second too quickly, her smile snapping into place like a mask clicking shut. "Just tidying up for him," Victoria had said sweetly. "You know how he is with paperwork." Maria had smiled back and said nothing. But her good eyes, the ones Eleanor Cole had once praised, had already caught the letterhead on that folder. A law firm. Not Ethan's law firm. One Maria had never seen before. Today was the wedding. In 6 hours, Ethan Cole would stand at the altar in the estate's grand ballroom, surrounded by 400 guests, 3 tiers of white peonies flown in from the Netherlands, and an orchestra that had once played for European royalty, and he would promise the rest of his life to a woman Maria did not trust. Maria smoothed down her apron, picked up her polishing cloth, and kept working. Because that's what she always did. She watched. She waited. She stayed close. She had no idea yet just how close she'd need to be by the end of the night, or that in a few short hours, one moment at that reception table would change the entire course of the Cole family forever. Down the hall, she heard Ethan's voice, warm and laughing, drifting from his dressing room. And underneath it, quieter, colder, Victoria's voice on the phone, speaking in a tone Maria had never once heard her use with Ethan. "It has to be tonight," Victoria was saying. "Before the ink dries on anything else. Just make sure it's done right." Maria stopped polishing. Her hand went still on the railing. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones the way you feel a storm before the sky even changes color. By 4 o'clock, the estate had transformed into something out of a fairy tale, if fairy tales came with a $2 million catering budget and a private security detail standing at every entrance. Maria moved through the chaos like a ghost, invisible in the way staff often are to the wealthy, which meant she heard everything. She heard the wedding planner arguing with the florist about the peonies wilting in the July heat. She heard Ethan's best man, a college friend named Marcus, joking nervously with the groomsmen about getting the ring guy through security. And she heard, tucked into a corner near the wine cellar stairs, a conversation that made the hair on her arm stand up. It was Victoria. And she wasn't alone. The man with her wasn't a guest Maria recognized, though something about him was familiar. Sharp suit, silver watch, the kind of practiced calm that lawyers and consultants wore like cologne. Maria busied herself rearranging a stack of linen napkins on a nearby cart, close enough to catch fragments. The prenup amendment goes into effect the moment the vows are said, the man was saying, voice low. After that, dissolving it gets a lot more complicated. You need him signing that estate transfer tonight, Victoria. Not next week. Tonight. He'll sign it, Victoria said, and there was something in her voice Maria had never heard before. Not warmth, not love, just cold calculation, smooth as glass. He signs anything I put in front of him when he's had a few drinks and I've got my hand on his arm. You know that. And if he doesn't feel like signing tonight? A pause. Long enough that Maria's heart began to pound. Then he won't be feeling much of anything, Victoria said quietly. Just make sure the toast glass is the one on the left. I'll handle the rest. Maria's hands had gone cold around the stack of napkins. She told herself she must have misheard. People said dramatic things in stressful moments. Weddings made everyone tense. But the tone, the specificity, the toast glass on the left. She thought about walking straight to Ethan's dressing room right then and telling him everything. But who would believe her? A maid, interrupting the groom 2 hours before his wedding, with nothing but a fragment of an overheard conversation and no proof at all? Victoria would simply smile that beautiful smile and call it a misunderstanding, and Maria, sweet, quiet, invisible Maria, would likely find herself unemployed by morning, dismissed as a jealous or confused member of the help. She'd seen it happen to other staff before, in other houses, for far less. No. She needed to know more. She needed proof. She spent the next 2 hours doing something she'd never done in 9 years of loyal service. She started paying very, very close attention to things that weren't her business. She watched the caterers set up the head table. She watched which glass went where. She noted, with a small chill, that the toast champagne flutes, an elegant set of hand-blown crystal that had belonged to Ethan's grandmother, were being laid out in a precise row, bride's side and groom's side. The groom's flute, she now saw clearly, sat to the left of the bride's. She thought of Eleanor Cole. Of the woman who'd looked her in the eye 9 years ago and said, "You see things other people miss." She thought of the little boy crying on the porch steps at midnight, the same boy who was now getting dressed in a white tuxedo down the hall, utterly unaware that the woman he was about to marry might be planning something far darker than a simple financial scheme. Maria made a decision then, standing in that gilded ballroom surrounded by peonies and crystal and 400 place settings. She was not going to let anything happen to that boy. Not on her watch. Not while she still had breath in her body and a good pair of eyes that saw things other people missed. She just had to figure out how to stop it without anyone, especially Victoria, realizing what she knew before it was too late. The clock on the ballroom wall read 5:15. The ceremony would begin at 6. The reception toast, according to the schedule pinned to the kitchen corkboard, was set for 7:30. Maria had a little over 2 hours to figure out how to save a man's life without anyone noticing she was trying. The ceremony was, by every outward measure, perfect. Ethan stood at the altar in the ballroom's east wing, sunlight pouring gold through the tall arched windows, and when Victoria walked down the aisle in ivory silk, a hush moved through the crowd like a held breath finally released. Maria watched from the back, near the service doors, dressed not in her usual grey uniform but in the simple black dress the household staff wore for formal events, close enough to see, far enough to remain invisible. Ethan's face, when he saw his bride, broke into the kind of smile Maria hadn't seen on him since before his mother passed. Pure, unguarded, trusting. It made what Maria knew that much harder to carry. She'd spent the last hour trying to think of a way to warn him, and every plan had collapsed under the same problem. She had nothing but a stolen fragment of conversation and a gut feeling. If she was wrong, if she'd misunderstood, if it was nothing, she would destroy a wedding, humiliate a bride, and very likely lose the only home and job she'd known in 9 years. And if she was right and did nothing, a man she loved like family might not survive the night. So she watched. And she waited by the wine cellar stairs, near the small service pantry just off the main hall, where she could see the caterers preparing the toast trays. At 7:15, 15 minutes before the toast, she saw him. The man in the sharp suit from the wine cellar conversation, Victoria's associate, slipping quietly into the pantry where the champagne flute sat waiting on silver trays, already poured, glinting gold under the kitchen lights. Maria's pulse spiked. She had no reason to be in that pantry. No task that would explain it. But she moved anyway, ducking through the side door just as the man was stepping back out, nearly colliding with her. "Sorry," she murmured, keeping her eyes down, playing the part of the flustered maid. He barely glanced at her, barely registered her as a person at all, and hurried off toward the ballroom. Maria's eyes went straight to the trays. 2 flutes sat apart from the others, positioned at the head of the tray closest to the ballroom doors, the ones destined for the head table. She leaned in close, heart hammering, and saw it. The faintest cloudiness at the bottom of the flute on the left, a barely visible residue that hadn't fully dissolved. Champagne didn't look like that. Champagne was clear, effervescent, golden all the way through. She didn't know what was in that glass. She didn't have time to find out. She only knew, with absolute bone-deep certainty, that it wasn't meant for celebration. She heard the orchestra shift into the toast fanfare, heard Marcus's voice, amplified through the ballroom speakers, announcing that the bride and groom would now share their first toast as husband and wife. There was no more time to think, to plan, to be careful. Maria picked up the tray herself, something the catering staff would normally never allow, but no one stopped a maid carrying glasses toward the head table, not in the chaos of a 400-person wedding, and walked straight into the ballroom. Ethan stood at the head table, champagne flute already being handed to him by a server, Victoria beaming beside him with her own glass raised, 400 guests rising to their feet with glasses lifted high, camera flashes already beginning to pop. "To us," Victoria said, loud enough for the room to hear, her eyes bright and warm and utterly convincing. "To the beginning of everything." Ethan smiled at her, raised the glass to his lips. And that's when Maria moved. She crossed the last 10 feet at a near run, reaching out with a strength she didn't know she had, and knocked the glass from his hand before it touched his mouth. "Don't drink that, sir." The crystal flute shattered against the marble floor, wine and whatever else had been dissolved into it spraying dark across white tablecloths, across Ethan's pristine tuxedo sleeve, across the stunned, silent faces of 400 wedding guests who had just watched the household maid physically assault the groom's hand at his own wedding toast. For one full second, the entire ballroom froze. Then Victoria's champagne flute slipped from her fingers too, not knocked away, just dropped, shattering beside the first, and her face, for just a fraction of an instant before she caught herself, was not confused. It was not shocked. It was afraid. And Ethan Cole, staring down at his empty hand, then at his shaking, terrified housekeeper, then at the fear flickering behind his bride's eyes, understood, in that single, silent, suspended moment, that his wedding day had just become something else entirely. "Maria, what on earth?" Ethan started, his voice caught somewhere between shock and anger, the room's 400 guests still frozen mid-toast around them. "Sir, please," Maria said, and her voice shook, but her eyes did not leave his. "Please, don't drink from that glass. I'm begging you. Test it before anyone touches another one. Test it." Victoria's laugh came out too sharp, too fast, cutting through the silence like glass. "Ethan, sweetheart, she's clearly had some kind of episode. Someone get her some water, get her outside." "No." Ethan held up a hand, and something in his voice made even his own bride go quiet. He'd spent 11 years building a company by trusting his instincts in boardrooms full of people trying to manipulate him, and right now, every one of those instincts was screaming. He looked down at the shattered glass on the floor, at the strange, faint residue clouding the spilled liquid where it hadn't yet soaked into the white tablecloth. At Maria, who had never in 9 years raised her voice to him, now standing there trembling but unmoving, refusing to back down even as 398 strangers stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Marcus," Ethan said quietly to his best man, "get Dr. Whitfield. He's here, table 12. Now." Dr. Whitfield, an old family friend and physician who'd treated the Coles for 2 decades, moved through the crowd within a minute, kneeling by the shattered glass with the calm precision of a man who'd seen far stranger things at far stranger parties. He didn't need to taste it. He dipped a napkin corner into the spilled liquid, held it briefly to his nose, and his expression changed. "This needs to go to a lab immediately," he said, low enough that only Ethan, Maria, and Victoria could hear. "But Ethan, I don't like this. I don't like this at all." "It's nothing," Victoria said quickly. Too quickly. "The caterers probably didn't clean the flutes properly. There's residue from the dishwasher, that's all this is." "Victoria." Ethan's voice was quiet now. Terribly quiet. "How did you know it was residue, before he even said anything?" The ballroom held its breath. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Maria had known her, the perfectly composed mask cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, but enough. Enough for Ethan to see it. Enough for 400 guests to see it. Enough for the wedding photographer, still reflexively snapping photos out of pure shock, to capture the exact moment Victoria Hartwell's carefully built world began to come apart. "I think," Ethan said slowly, turning to face the room, his voice carrying with the same calm authority he used in boardrooms, "that we're going to pause the celebration for a moment." Security, who had been stationed discreetly around the ballroom's perimeter all evening, quietly moved to the exits, not aggressively, but unmistakably. "Ethan, you're embarrassing yourself," Victoria hissed, her composure fully cracked now, panic seeping through. "In front of everyone. Over what? A maid's paranoid delusion." "Maria has worked for this family for 9 years, Ethan said, and his voice had gone cold in a way Maria had genuinely never heard from him before. "She has never once given me a reason to doubt her. You've been my fiancé for 8 months, and I just watched you know a glass was tampered with before anyone told you it was." He turned to Maria then, and something in his expression, beneath the shock, beneath the fear of what almost just happened, was gratitude so raw it made Maria's throat tighten. "How did you know?" he asked her quietly. Maria's hands were still shaking. 400 people were still staring. But she made herself speak. "I overheard something this afternoon, sir. Near the wine cellar. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I promise you that. But I heard your fiancé tell a man that the toast glass on the left needed to be handled." Maria's voice cracked. "I saw the same man in the pantry 15 minutes before the toast. I saw the residue in the glass myself. I didn't have proof. I only had a feeling, and what I heard, and I couldn't let you drink it without at least trying to stop you." The ballroom was utterly silent now, 400 wedding guests witnessing what would become, by morning, one of the most talked-about scandals the city's social circles had seen in a decade. Victoria's eyes darted toward the ballroom's side exit, toward the man in the sharp suit, who was already backing quietly toward the door, trying to slip out unnoticed. "Security," Ethan said, without raising his voice. "Please make sure no one leaves this room until the police arrive." And as two guards moved to block the exits, Victoria Hartwell, 33 years old, radiant in ivory silk, minutes from becoming Mrs. Ethan Cole, realized that the wedding she had spent 8 months orchestrating had just collapsed in front of everyone who mattered, undone by the sharp eyes of a housekeeper nobody in that room had thought to notice until now. The police arrived within 20 minutes, though to the 400 stunned guests still seated in the ballroom, unsure whether to leave or stay, it felt like hours. Maria stood off to the side near the service doors, arms wrapped around herself, replaying the moment over and over. The shatter of crystal, the fear flashing across Victoria's face, Ethan's stunned, grateful eyes. She hadn't expected to feel this shaken afterward. In the moment, instinct had carried her. Now, in the aftermath, her hands wouldn't stop trembling. "You saved his life," said a voice beside her. She turned to find Marcus, Ethan's best man, standing there with 2 glasses of water, offering her one. His tuxedo jacket was rumpled, his bow tie loosened, and his face still carried the shell-shocked look of a man whose best friend's wedding had just become a crime scene. "I don't know that for certain," Maria said quietly, taking the water with unsteady hands. "I only know something was wrong." "Dr. Whitfield already called," Marcus said. "Preliminary field test on the residue came back positive for a cardiac medication. The kind that, in someone without a heart condition, in high enough doses, can trigger a fatal arrhythmia within an hour. Slow enough to look natural. Fast enough that by the time anyone thought to question it, Ethan would already be gone." Maria closed her eyes. She had known, somewhere in her bones, that something terrible was coming. But hearing it confirmed, hearing just how close it had actually been, made her knees go momentarily weak. Marcus steadied her elbow gently. "He would have collapsed on the dance floor," Marcus said quietly. "In front of everyone. And it would have looked like a tragic, sudden heart failure on his wedding night. No one would have suspected a thing." Across the ballroom, Maria could see Ethan speaking with 2 detectives near the head table, his jaw tight, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Victoria, who sat now in a chair near the far wall, flanked by an officer, her ivory gown looking suddenly less like a wedding dress and more like a costume from a play that had gone terribly wrong. The man in the sharp suit, later identified as Grant Michaels, a financial consultant with a history of estate restructuring for wealthy clients under mysterious circumstances, had been stopped at the door and was now being questioned separately. It took another hour for the full shape of it to emerge, pieced together from Victoria's phone records, seized with a warrant obtained astonishingly fast given the Cole family's influence, and from Grant Michaels, who, faced with attempted murder and conspiracy charges, began talking almost immediately in exchange for leniency. The plan, detectives explained quietly to Ethan and the small circle around him, had been in motion for months. Victoria had never come from old money at all, that had been a fabrication from the very beginning, constructed carefully over years, complete with a fake family history and forged references that nobody had thought to verify, because who verifies a woman as polished, as charming, as effortlessly convincing as Victoria Hartwell? She had targeted Ethan specifically after his mother's death, when detectives believed she'd correctly calculated he would be emotionally vulnerable, isolated, and eager for connection. The engagement had been fast, faster than anyone in Ethan's circle had felt entirely comfortable with, though no one had wanted to voice that discomfort and risk upsetting him during his grief. The estate transfer document Victoria had been pressuring Ethan to sign as a wedding gift to their future together would have quietly restructured ownership of 2 of his company's core subsidiaries into a shared trust. One that, in the event of his death, would transfer entirely to her, bypassing his existing will altogether. And the wedding night poisoning wasn't even the first attempt. Detectives found records suggesting a similar, smaller-scale incident 3 months earlier. A sudden, unexplained illness Ethan had suffered after a private dinner with Victoria, one doctors had chalked up at the time to food poisoning. Maria remembered that night. She remembered sitting up until 3 a.m. keeping watch outside his bedroom door, unable to sleep, though she hadn't understood then why her instincts had been screaming at her so loudly. "You knew something was wrong even then, didn't you?" Ethan asked her later that night, once the guest had gone, once Victoria had been formally arrested and led out through the same doors she'd walked through hours earlier as a radiant bride, once the ballroom sat empty and littered with abandoned place settings and wilting peonies. Maria sat across from him at the now empty head table, still in her simple black dress, exhaustion settling into every part of her body. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I just felt it. The way your mother used to say, I see things other people miss." Ethan's eyes filled, unexpectedly, at the mention of his mother. "She was right about you," he said quietly. "She was right about a lot of things." The days that followed unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake, aftershocks rippling outward through Ethan's entire life. The news broke by morning. Celebrity billionaire's bride arrested at wedding for attempted poisoning, the headlines screamed, and by afternoon it had become the top trending story across every major outlet in the country. Photographers camped outside the estate gates. Old business associates called with awkward, overly careful condolences. Reporters offered absurd sums for an exclusive interview, all of which Ethan refused. Through all of it, Maria kept working, kept the house running, kept coffee brewing at 6 a.m. sharp, black with 1 sugar cube, even on the mornings Ethan didn't come down to drink it because he was locked in his study with lawyers and detectives, poring over documents that revealed just how deep Victoria's deception had gone. It turned out the folder Maria had seen Victoria hiding in the study weeks earlier hadn't been wedding paperwork at all. It had been an early draft of the estate transfer, along with a forged medical directive granting Victoria emergency healthcare power of attorney, something Ethan had never signed, never even seen, until his own lawyer pulled it from evidence and slid it across the desk with a grim expression. "If she'd married you," his lawyer said quietly, "and then something had happened to you that night, or even months later, heart condition, sudden illness, anything that looked natural, this document alone would have let her make every medical decision in your final hours. No family override. No question asked, because legally, she'd have been your wife." Ethan sat in silence for a long moment after his lawyer left, staring at the forged signature at the bottom of the page. His own name, written in a hand skilled enough to fool even people who'd known his real signature for years. Maria found him there an hour later, still sitting in the same chair, the study dark except for the desk lamp, untouched coffee gone cold beside him. "You should eat something, sir," she said gently. The way she'd said it 100 times before, in 100 quieter moments over the years. "I almost married a woman who was going to kill me for my money," Ethan said, not looking up. 8 months, Maria. 8 months I spent completely blind to it. My own mother would be horrified at how easily I let someone in. "Your mother," Maria said carefully, "would be proud of how you handled the truth once it came out. That matters more than how long it took to see it." Ethan finally looked up at her, something raw and searching in his expression. "Why did you stay quiet for so long? You must have suspected something for weeks. Months, maybe. Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Maria considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "Because I had no proof, sir. Only feelings. And feelings, coming from the housekeeper, about the woman you loved and were about to marry. I was afraid you'd hear it as jealousy, or bitterness, or an old woman meddling where she didn't belong. I was afraid you'd let her convince you I was the problem, and then I'd lose the only real proof I had, my closeness to this house, to you, before I ever had the chance to actually protect you when it mattered most." Ethan absorbed this for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "You're 32 years old, Maria. You're not old. And you were never just the housekeeper. Not to me. Not for a long time." It was the first time in 9 years he'd said something like that out loud, and Maria felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Your mother saw something in you the day she hired you," Ethan continued. "I think I understand now what it was. It wasn't just that you kept the house well. It's that you actually cared what happened inside it. To the people inside it. Victoria never cared about this house, or what happened inside it, at all. She only cared what she could take from it." Outside, the sun was beginning to set over the estate grounds, gold light spilling across the same lawn where wedding chairs still sat in rows, waiting to be dismantled, a stark, sad reminder of the day that never got its ending. "What happens now?" Maria asked softly. Ethan looked at the cold coffee, then out the window, then finally back at her. "Now," he said, "I think it's time I actually started paying attention to the people who've been paying attention to me all along." 3 weeks after the wedding that never happened, the trial preparations moved quickly, propelled by overwhelming evidence: financial records, forged documents, testimony from Grant Michaels, and lab results confirming the cardiac medication in the champagne flute had been dosed at a level detectives called unmistakably lethal for a man with no prior heart condition. Victoria's bail was denied. Her real name, detectives eventually confirmed, wasn't even Victoria Hartwell, it was Diane Kowalski, a woman with 2 prior aliases and a trail of wealthy former partners across 3 states, several of whom investigators were now quietly reopening files on, including one fiancé from 4 years earlier who had died of what was ruled at the time a sudden cardiac event, eerily similar in nature to what almost happened to Ethan. The revelation hit Ethan hard. Harder, in some ways, than the poisoning itself. "She'd done this before," he said one evening, sitting at the kitchen island while Maria prepared dinner, something he'd started doing in recent weeks, sitting with her in the kitchen rather than eating alone in the formal dining room, as though the grandeur of the house had lost some of its comfort for him and he needed something simpler, something real. Someone else died, Maria. Someone else's family lost him, and nobody ever knew why. And I almost became the second name on that list. Maria set down her knife and looked at him directly. "But you didn't. Because of what happened in that ballroom. Some things go the way they're supposed to, sir, even when it doesn't feel like there was any reason they should have." "Ethan," he said. "What?" "Just Ethan. Please. After what happened, after what you did, I don't think I can keep hearing you call me sir like nothing's changed." Maria felt something shift quietly in her chest, something she didn't quite have words for yet. "Ethan," she said, testing the shape of it. He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in 3 weeks, small and tired but genuine. Over the following days, something in the household did begin to change, slowly, the way a house settles after a storm has passed through it. Ethan started coming down for coffee again at 6 a.m., sitting at the kitchen island instead of his study, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable quiet while Maria moved around the kitchen. He asked her, for the first time in 9 years, about her own life, about the small apartment across town, about the daughter she'd been raising alone since her own husband passed 6 years earlier, about the community college night classes she'd been quietly taking for the past 2 years toward a business degree. Something she'd never once mentioned to anyone in this house because she'd never imagined anyone here would care to ask. "You're getting a degree," Ethan said one morning, genuinely surprised, "and you never told anyone." "It didn't seem like something that belonged in this house," Maria admitted. "This house is about your life, sir, Ethan. Not mine." "That's going to change," Ethan said simply, and something in his tone told her he meant it as more than just a passing comment. He didn't say anything further that morning. But 2 days later, an envelope appeared on the small table in the staff break room, addressed simply to Maria. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Ethan's own hand, and a check that made her sit down hard on the nearest chair. The letter explained that he wanted to fully fund the remainder of her business degree, cover any additional certifications she wanted to pursue, and, if she was interested, no pressure, entirely her choice, offer her a newly created position within his company's operations division once she graduated, a role built around the exact kind of sharp, careful attention to detail that had saved his life. "You said your daughter is 8. The letter ended. My mother used to say that the way you build a better life for your children says everything about the person you actually are. I'd like to help you build a better one for yours, the way you helped save mine. Not as payment. Not as charity. As respect, finally given where it was long overdue. Maria sat alone in the small break room for a long time after reading it, letter trembling slightly in her hands, thinking about 9 years of 6 a.m. coffee, of quiet loyalty, of good eyes that saw things other people missed, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself cry, not out of fear or exhaustion, but out of something that felt, unmistakably, like being truly seen. 6 weeks later, the trial began. Maria hadn't expected to be called as a witness, but she was the prosecution's opening witness. In fact, the woman whose split-second decision had stopped what the district attorney called, in her opening statement, a calculated, cold-blooded execution disguised as a wedding toast. Sitting in the witness stand, facing a courtroom packed with reporters and the woman she'd once served coffee to every morning now seated at the defense table in a plain grey suit, stripped of the ivory silk and the diamond earrings and every carefully constructed layer of charm, Maria felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not fear. Not even anger, really. Just clarity. Ms. Alvarez, the prosecutor asked, can you tell the court what made you suspicious enough, that evening, to intervene the way you did? Maria thought of Eleanor Cole. Of 9 years of watching, quietly, carefully, without anyone ever asking her to. Of the strange folder on the desk, the hushed phone call by the wine cellar stairs, the residue clouding a champagne flute that should have been perfectly clear. I've spent 9 years taking care of that family, Maria said, her voice steady despite the weight of the room around her. You learn to notice things when you truly care about the people you're taking care of. Small things. Things that don't quite fit. I noticed things that didn't fit, and I couldn't let a feeling like that go unspoken, not when someone's life might depend on it. Across the courtroom, Victoria, Diane, sat perfectly still, her lawyer whispering something in her ear, her expression unreadable in a way that no longer unsettled Maria the way it once might have. Whatever power that carefully constructed mask once held, it had shattered completely the moment that champagne flute hit the marble floor, and no amount of composure in a courtroom could rebuild it now. The trial lasted 11 days. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged medical directive, the financial records showing years of similar schemes across multiple states, the toxicology report confirming the lethal dose in the champagne, Grant Michaels's detailed testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence, and, perhaps most damning of all, records connecting Diane Kowalski to the sudden, previously unexplained death of her fiancé 4 years earlier, a case that had since been formally reopened as a homicide. Investigation. On the 12th day, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts: attempted murder, conspiracy, forgery, and financial fraud. The judge, citing the calculated and repeated nature of the scheme, sentenced her to 35 years without possibility of parole for a minimum term of 25. Ethan sat through every single day of the trial, Maria beside him more days than not, at his quiet request. When the verdict was read, he didn't smile, didn't cheer the way some of his friends in the gallery did. He simply closed his eyes for a long moment, exhaled, and reached over to squeeze Maria's hand. "It's over," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "It's over," Maria agreed. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as they always did, cameras flashing in a chaotic blur, but Ethan didn't stop to answer any of them. He walked straight past the microphones, past the shouted questions about how it felt to see justice served, past the offers for exclusive interviews about the wedding that almost turned deadly, and instead, in front of every camera and every reporter and every headline that would run the next morning, he stopped, turned to Maria, and said clearly, so there could be no mistaking it, no spin put on it by anyone. "This woman saved my life. Not the police. Not security. Not anyone with a badge or a title. My housekeeper did, because she cared enough to notice what everyone else missed. I hope every single person reading about this tomorrow remembers that name. Maria Alvarez. Not the woman who tried to destroy my life. Her. For months after the trial ended, the Cole estate looked different than it had on that terrible wedding night. Not in its bones, its chandeliers and marble staircases and gilded moldings all remained exactly as they'd always been, but in something harder to name. Something lighter, maybe. Something that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Maria still worked there, though her role had shifted in ways neither of them could have predicted a year earlier. She'd finished her business degree that spring, top of her class, and taken the operations position Ethan had offered. Not out of pity, she'd come to understand, but because she was, in fact, exceptionally good at it. Sharp-eyed, detail-oriented, unwilling to let small inconsistencies slide, the exact instincts that had once kept a household running smoothly now applied to supply chains and vendor contracts, and the kind of careful auditing that, 6 months into her new role, caught a minor accounting discrepancy that saved the company nearly $2 million before it became a much larger problem. "You have good eyes," Ethan told her one afternoon, echoing his mother's words from 9 years earlier, watching her review a contract with the same careful focus she'd once used to inspect a champagne flute for residue that shouldn't have been there. "I don't think I fully understood what that meant until I nearly lost my life because of it." Their relationship had changed too, slowly, honestly, without either of them rushing it. It wasn't the kind of thing either of them announced or made a spectacle of. No ballroom, no 400 guests, no crystal flutes raised in a toast. It started small. Dinners in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. Long conversations on the back porch, the same steps where she'd once wrapped a blanket around his shaking shoulders after his mother's funeral. A quiet Sunday morning, months later, where he reached for her hand across the kitchen island and didn't let go, and neither of them needed to say anything at all for it to mean everything. "I used to think loyalty like yours was just part of the job," Ethan told her one evening, the two of them sitting on that same back porch, watching the sun sink behind the estate's old oak trees. "I didn't understand, until everything fell apart, that real loyalty, the kind that actually shows up when it costs something, isn't something you can hire. It's something you either have, or you don't." "Your mother had it too," Maria said softly. "She saw it in me because she recognized it in herself. She never let this family forget what actually mattered, even with all this." She gestured toward the grand house behind them, around her. "She'd have loved you," Ethan said. "Not just for what you did that night. For who you've always been, every single day before it. I think, somewhere, some part of me chose Victoria because she was easy, beautiful, charming, uncomplicated in the way a magazine cover is uncomplicated. And I think some part of me was always a little afraid to really see you, because seeing you clearly would have meant admitting how much I'd already come to depend on you, long before any of this happened." Maria didn't answer right away. The evening settled around them, warm and quiet, the kind of ordinary peaceful moment that felt, after everything, almost unbelievably precious. "For what it's worth," she finally said, "I'm glad you see me now." Ethan turned to look at her, really look at her, the way he'd learned to look at people over the past several months, carefully, honestly, without the polish and performance that had once nearly cost him his life. "So am I," he said. "So am I." A year to the day after that wedding that never was, Maria stood once more in the Cole estate's grand ballroom. The same room, the same chandeliers, the same marble floor that had once been scattered with shattered crystal and spilled wine. But everything else was different. This time, there were only 40 guests, not 400. This time, the flowers were simple white roses instead of imported peonies. This time, when Maria walked down that same aisle, she wasn't carrying a tray of champagne flutes toward a stranger's toast. She was walking toward Ethan, her hand in her daughter's, who walked proudly beside her in a small white dress, having very seriously accepted the role of flower girl months earlier and taken it more seriously than anyone in the wedding party. There was no elaborate consultant-run production. No hidden agenda. No sharp-suited man slipping quietly through service doors. Just the people who had actually shown up for this family, year after year, through everything. Dr. Whitfield stood among the guests, along with Marcus, along with the small handful of household staff who'd become, over the past year, something closer to family than employees. And near the front, Maria caught sight of a framed photograph Ethan had placed quietly on a small table beside the altar. His mother, Eleanor, smiling the same warm, knowing smile she'd worn the day she told a nervous young woman fresh off a bus from Ohio, "You have good eyes." "I don't have a long speech prepared," Ethan said during his vows, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Maria. "Because I've already learned the hard way that the people who talk the most beautifully aren't always the ones who mean it the most. What I know is this. 9 years ago, my mother saw something in you that I was too blind to fully understand until I nearly lost everything. She saw someone who pays attention. Someone who cares enough to notice the things that matter, even when noticing them costs something. Someone who shows up every single day, not because anyone's watching, but because it's who you are." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I don't want a life built on performances and polish anymore. I want a life built with someone who actually sees me, the real me, the messy, imperfect, sometimes too trusting me, and stays anyway. I want that with you, Maria. For the rest of my life." There wasn't a dry eye in that small, quiet ballroom. When Maria said her own vows, she thought of everything it had taken to arrive at this exact moment. 9 years of quiet loyalty, one terrifying decision made in a split second that could have gone so differently, months of slowly, carefully learning what it meant to be truly seen instead of simply useful. "I used to think love, real love, looked like grand gestures," she said. "Chandeliers and crystal and 400 guests. But I've learned this year that real love looks like 6 a.m. coffee, and someone finally asking about your life instead of just needing you to manage theirs, and choosing to trust someone with your whole heart even after that trust nearly got broken in the worst possible way. I choose you, Ethan. Not because of any of this," she gestured gently at the grand room around them, "but because of everything underneath it." If there's one thing this story leaves us with, it's this. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly, who love us most faithfully, aren't the ones dressed in the finest silk or standing in the brightest spotlight. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the steady ones, the ones who've been paying attention all along, simply waiting for the moment we're finally ready to truly see them too. Real loyalty doesn't announce itself with grand declarations. It shows up quietly, consistently, and when it matters most, it reaches out and catches you before you even know you're falling. If this story touched your heart today, don't scroll past without hitting that like button. It truly helps this channel more than you know. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Share it with someone you love, someone who might need this reminder today that real love and real loyalty are still out there, quietly waiting to be seen. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.